That's crazy, Mark. You think you're taking the house and the company? I smiled, sliding my phone across the crisp white tablecloth. The investors are on speakerphone right now, and they've heard every single word. Have you ever sacrificed everything for someone only to discover they were secretly planning your downfall? Tell me how you survived it in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for the full story. But to understand how I built an impenetrable fortress right under his nose, we have to go back to the morning I thought my life was perfect. Today marks our 5th wedding anniversary. To the outside world, Mark and I are the picture of a modern, successful couple. We built our tech logistics company from the ground up, starting in the tiny living room of our first apartment. Now, we are standing on the precipice of a major nationwide expansion. As I sit at my vanity, carefully applying my makeup, I look at the woman in the mirror. She looks calm, polished, and ready for a celebration. But beneath the surface, my heart is beating with a heavy, steady rhythm of absolute resolve. Mark promised me a spectacular evening. He booked a private table at Le Petit Chien, the most exclusive restaurant in the city, a place that requires reservations months in advance. Dressed to the nines, darling, he had told me this morning, kissing my forehead with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. We have a lot to talk about tonight. Big changes are coming for us. He thinks he is the architect of these changes. He believes he holds all the cards, ready to lay them out on the crisp white linen tablecloth tonight. I know exactly what he plans to do. I have known for an entire year. The weight of this secret has been a crushing burden, turning my love for him into a cold, hard stone. Yet I have played my part flawlessly. I have smiled at his jokes, attended the corporate galas on his arm, and pretended not to notice the lingering perfume on his coats. Tonight, the charade finally ends. I adjust my emerald necklace, take a deep breath, and prepare to shatter the fragile glass house he thinks he owns. The nightmare began exactly 365 days ago, shortly after our 4th anniversary. I was looking for a digital copy of our home insurance policy on Mark's iPad, which we usually shared for household administration. A notification popped up on the screen, bypassing the usual privacy settings. It was a message from Chloe, his newly hired executive assistant. It didn't say anything about schedules or board meetings. It read, "I can't wait until you finally tell her, Mark. This house is going to look so much better once I redecorate." My breath caught in my throat. My hands trembled violently as I opened the hidden messaging app. What I found was a devastating chronicle of emotional and professional betrayal. They weren't just having an affair. They were meticulously planning to push me out. Messages detailed how Mark intended to systematically devalue my shares in the company, the very company started with my late father's inheritance. Chloe, ambitious and ruthlessly smug, was right there with him, cheerleading his every move. I sat on the edge of our marital bed, the screen glowing in the dimly lit room, feeling as though the floor had completely vanished beneath me. There were no tears initially, just a profound, suffocating numbness. The man who had vowed to protect and cherish me was plotting to leave me with nothing. He wanted to rewrite our history, erasing my contributions, and hand our shared kingdom over to a woman who saw me as nothing more than a temporary obstacle. In that silent, devastating hour, the loving wife in me died, and a fiercely protective survivor took her place. For the first few weeks after my discovery, I moved through life like a ghost haunting my own home. The grief was a physical ache, a tightness in my chest that made drawing a full breath impossible. Every time Mark came home, casually asking about my day, I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw his iPad across the room and demand answers. I wanted to ask him why my love, my loyalty, and my financial backing weren't enough, but I knew that confronting him then would be a fatal mistake. Mark was a masterful manipulator, adept at twisting words and shifting blame. If I blew up in a fit of emotional rage, he would paint me as the hysterical wife, accelerating his plans before I could secure my own future. I had to swallow my despair and wear a mask of absolute normalcy. I spent long afternoons sitting alone in the park, letting the tears fall where no one could see them. I mourned the future I thought we would share, the children we hadn't yet had, the vacations we had planned, the simple comfort of growing old together. I grieved for the man I thought he was. But slowly, as the weeks turned into a month, the sorrow crystallized into clarity. I realized that my father's legacy and my own years of exhausting labor were on the line. I wiped my tears, squared my shoulders, and made a silent vow. I would not be a victim in my own life story. Once my tears dried, the real work began. I discreetly reached out to an old family friend, a formidable corporate attorney known for her airtight contracts and unwavering discretion. Under the guise of joining a weekly book club, I spent hours in her downtown office, laying out the evidence of Mark's intentions. Together, we scrutinized the founding documents of our company. Because we had started the business before we were officially married, and because the initial capital was entirely mine, I had leverage Mark had foolishly overlooked in his arrogance. We spent months drafting the paperwork. I quietly transferred the deed of our home, which was solely in my name, and my controlling shares of the company into an irrevocable trust fund. I legally restructured the board of directors, ensuring my voting power was absolute and untouchable. The process was grueling. It required me to smile at Mark across the dinner table while knowing I was legally dismantling the foundation of his deceit. I also began building relationships with our primary investors.
I scheduled private lunches, sharing my long-term vision for the company, subtly establishing myself as the true indispensable leader without ever mentioning Mark's indiscretions. I ensured they trusted me implicitly. Every signature, every notarized document was a quiet victory against the betrayal. By the time our 5th anniversary approached, my fortress was complete.
I was no longer just a wife. I was a fortress, impenetrable and entirely secure. The morning of our 5th anniversary dawned bright and deceptively cheerful. Mark woke me up with a bouquet of red roses and a cup of artisan coffee, playing the role of the devoted husband to absolute perfection. "Happy anniversary, my love," he whispered, kissing my cheek. "Tonight is going to be unforgettable." "I have no doubt it will be," I replied, my voice perfectly steady. I accepted the coffee, forcing myself not to pull away from his touch. As he stepped into the shower, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. The screen lit up with a notification from Chloe. Even now, they couldn't help themselves. I glanced at it. "Everything is set. The papers are in your briefcase. I'll meet you at the restaurant. Can't wait to see her face." A cold, mirthless smile touched my lips. She couldn't wait to see my face? The irony was almost poetic. I finished my coffee, the bitter taste grounding me in reality. I spent the rest of the day finalizing my own preparations. I sent a quick, encrypted message to the lead investor of our company, confirming the exact time for our scheduled silent conference call that evening. I carefully selected a stunning, tailored crimson dress for the dinner. If I was going to attend a funeral for my marriage, I was going to look absolutely triumphant doing it. I slipped my phone into my clutch, ensuring it was fully charged. The stage was set, the actors were moving into their places, and the curtain was about to rise. The ride to Le Petit Chien was cloaked in a suffocating silence that Mark mistook for comfortable intimacy. He held my hand in the back seat of the town car, his thumb tracing the diamond on my ring finger. I looked out the window at the passing city lights, feeling the ghostly echo of the love I once held for this man. A year ago, this car ride would have filled me with butterflies.
Tonight, I was merely a soldier riding toward the front lines. We arrived at the restaurant, an opulent establishment draped in velvet and glittering chandeliers. The maitre d' greeted Mark by name, bowing slightly before leading us to a secluded corner booth flanked by heavy privacy curtains. It was the perfect setting for an intimate celebration, or a quiet execution.
Mark held my chair for me, ever the gentleman in public. "You look breathtaking tonight," he murmured as he took his seat across from me. "That dress is striking." "Thank you, Mark. I thought crimson was fitting for the occasion," I replied, my voice smooth and even. I arranged my napkin on my lap, feeling the solid weight of my phone nestled inside my clutch.
My heart beat a steady, rhythmic drum against my ribs. I had spent 12 agonizing months mourning the death of our marriage in absolute secrecy. Now, as I looked into his familiar eyes, I felt no sadness, no hesitation, only the cold, hard resolve of a woman who had meticulously built her own lifeboat while her husband was busy sinking their ship.
Before the sommelier could even offer us the wine list, the heavy velvet curtain shielding our booth was pulled back. There stood Chloe, Mark's executive assistant. She was wearing a sleek, tailored black dress, her lips painted a bold shade of plum. She looked entirely out of place for a private anniversary dinner, yet her posture radiated an unearned arrogance.
"Ah, right on time," Mark said, sitting up straighter. He didn't even have the decency to look embarrassed. He gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Sit down, Chloe." I raised an eyebrow, maintaining a mask of polite confusion. "Mark? I thought tonight was supposed to be just the two of us. Is there an emergency of the office?"
Mark cleared his throat, adjusting his tie with a sudden nervous energy. "Not an emergency, exactly, but there are some urgent matters we need to discuss, and Chloe has been instrumental in organizing the paperwork. It's better that she's here." Chloe slid into the booth, sitting uncomfortably close to my husband. She offered me a smile that was all teeth and no warmth.
"Happy anniversary," she said, the words dripping with condescension. "Mark said you wouldn't mind me crashing. We have a lot of ground to cover tonight." I looked between the two of them. The sheer audacity of bringing his mistress to our anniversary dinner to orchestrate my downfall was staggering. I let out a soft, measured breath. "I see," I replied calmly. "Well then, let's get down to business." The waiter arrived, oblivious to the thick tension radiating from our table, and poured water into our crystal goblets. Once he retreated, the silence stretched, heavy and expectant. Mark reached down and retrieved a thick, beige manila envelope from his leather briefcase. He placed it squarely in the center of the white tablecloth, right next to the flickering candlelight. "I don't know an easy way to say this," Mark began, his tone shifting into the practiced, measured voice he used during difficult board meetings. He wasn't speaking to his wife, he was addressing a redundancy. "We've had a good run, but things have changed. My vision for the future, both personally and professionally, doesn't align with ours anymore." He slid the envelope toward me. I didn't reach for it. I just stared at the bold, capitalized words printed on the tab. Dissolution of marriage. "These are divorce papers," Mark stated, as if clarifying a complex financial report. "I've already signed my portion. I've tried to be as fair as possible, given the circumstances. But we need to sever our ties cleanly."
A flicker of genuine pain threatened to break through my carefully constructed armor. 5 years of marriage. Late nights eating takeout on the floor of our first office, holding him when his mother passed away, pouring my entire inheritance into his dreams, reduced to a beige envelope slid across a restaurant table. I swallowed the lump in my throat, refusing to let them see me bleed.
Before I could process the surreal nature of Mark's cold delivery, Chloe leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. She looked at me not with pity, but with a triumphant, predatory gleam in her eyes. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the grand finale she had typed out in those hidden messages a year ago. "Look, we don't want to make this messy," Chloe said, her voice dripping with faux sympathy. She actually had the nerve to reach out and place her hand over Mark's. But Mark has built this company from nothing, and he needs a partner who can keep up with his trajectory. The terms in there are simple. We're taking the house in the suburbs, and he retains full controlling interest of the company. She smirked, a tiny, victorious upward curl of her lip. We think it's for the best. You'll get a modest buyout, of course, enough to start over somewhere quieter. Mark nodded in agreement, utterly spineless. Chloe's right. You never really had the stomach for the corporate world anyway. It's better if I take the helm completely. I'll give you 30 days to pack up your things at the house. I looked at the woman who thought she was stealing my life, and the man who was cowardly enough to let her do his dirty work. They expected tears. They expected a hysterical scene, screaming, perhaps a glass of water thrown in Mark's face. They expected a broken, defeated victim. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and let out a soft, genuine laugh. My laughter startled them. Mark's confident posture faltered, and Chloe's smirk vanished, replaced by a deep, sudden frown. I'm sorry, I said, wiping a tear of mirth from my eye. I reached into my clutch and slowly pulled out my smartphone. I didn't think you two would actually follow through with exactly the script I read on your iPad a year ago. Word for word, Mark? Really? Mark's face drained of color. What are you talking about? I didn't raise my voice. I kept my tone conversational, pleasant, and utterly lethal. That's crazy, Mark. You think you're taking the house and the company? I transferred all the assets, the house deed, my controlling shares, everything, into an irrevocable trust fund a year ago when I found your hidden messages.
Chloe scoffed, though her voice shook. You can't do that. Mark is the CEO. I can, I replied, tapping the screen of my phone to wake it up. Because the initial capital was entirely my inheritance, and the foundational bylaws gave me absolute veto power. Power I exercised 6 months ago. I set the phone down on the table, the screen displaying an active call timer that read 45 minutes. Oh, and Mark? I smiled, pointing at the glowing screen. The primary investors are on speakerphone right now. They've heard every word of this lovely anniversary dinner. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the table, broken only by the sound of a throat clearing from the tiny speaker. It was Mr. Sterling, the lead investor. Mark, Mr. Sterling's deep, authoritative voice crackled through the phone. We need to have a very serious conversation. Mark sat frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The silence that followed Mr. Sterling's voice was the loudest sound I had ever heard. Mark stared at the phone as if it had suddenly turned into a venomous snake. The color had completely vanished from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very small inside his expensive tailored suit. Mr. Sterling, Mark stammered, his polished, confident boardroom voice cracking under the weight of his panic. This is a personal matter. It's a misunderstanding. My wife is just upset. We are not interested in your personal matters, Mark, Mr. Sterling's voice replied, sharp and unforgiving. We are, however, deeply invested in the stability and integrity of this company. The board was made aware of the trust fund restructuring months ago. We agreed to it because your wife presented a solid, undeniable vision for our future, coupled with the capital she rightfully controls. Hearing you attempt to strip her of her assets and jeopardize our leadership structure for this is unacceptable. I watched Mark's hands begin to shake. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate pleading that I had never seen before. He was waiting for me to save him, just as I had always done. Whenever he over-leveraged our finances in the early days, whenever he missed a crucial deadline, I was the one who pulled all-nighters to fix his mistakes. You knew? Mark whispered to me, the reality finally sinking in. You sat there for a year, knowing all of this? I protected my father's legacy, Mark, I said, my voice steady, though my heart ached with the memory of the love that used to bind us.
You handed our future away. I simply caught it before it hit the ground."
While Mark was crumbling, I turned my attention to Chloe. The triumphant, predatory smirk that had danced on her lips mere minutes ago had completely dissolved. She was looking at Mark not with the devotion of a loving partner, but with the cold, hard calculation of someone who realized they had just bet their entire life savings on a losing horse.
"Wait," Chloe said, her voice rising in pitch as she looked frantically between Mark and me. "Mark, you told me the house was yours. You said the company shares were in your name. You promised me." Mark couldn't even look at her. He buried his face in his hands. The illusion of his untouchable power shattered into a million irreparable pieces.
Chloe stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the polished hardwood floor of the restaurant. The elegant, sophisticated persona she had tried to project fell away entirely. "You have nothing?" she hissed at him, ignoring my presence entirely now. "You're telling me I wasted a year of my life organizing your schedule and lying for a man who doesn't even own his own house?"
"Chloe, please," Mark begged weakly, reaching a hand out toward her. She swatted his hand away. Without another word to him, she grabbed her designer purse, likely bought with the company credit card I had canceled that very afternoon, and stormed out of the restaurant. She didn't look back. She didn't offer a word of comfort. The grand romance they had built in the shadows was instantly exposed for what it truly was, an empty transaction built on lies, greed, and a staggering amount of arrogance. I sat quietly, watching the wreckage of their betrayal tear itself apart.
"The board expects your formal resignation on my desk by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, Mark," Mr. Sterling said through the phone, breaking the heavy silence left in Chloe's wake. "Have a good evening." The line clicked, and the call ended. I picked up my phone, slipping it back into my clutch with steady hands.
Mark was still sitting there, completely paralyzed by the sudden, absolute destruction of his life. He looked up at me, his eyes brimming with tears. "Why didn't you just tell me?" he choked out. "Why let me walk into this?" "Because you needed to show me exactly who you were," I answered softly. The anger was gone now, replaced by a profound, overwhelming sorrow.
"You were willing to leave me with nothing. You were willing to erase me." I stood up, smoothing the front of my crimson dress. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel the euphoric rush of victory I thought I might. I just felt an exhausting, hollow ache. I signaled the waiter, placing a crisp $100 bill on the table to cover the untouched water.
"Your bags are already packed, Mark," I told him, looking down at the man I had promised to spend my life with. "I had the locks changed this morning. Your suitcases are waiting with the concierge at your downtown club. Do not come to the house." I walked away from the table, my heels clicking softly against the floor. I walked out of the restaurant and into the cool night air, leaving my husband, my marriage, and the illusion of my perfect life behind me. When I finally arrived back at our house, the silence of the empty rooms hit me like a physical blow. This was the house we had bought together, the walls we had painted, the garden we had planted with our own hands. It was legally secured, safe within the fortress of the trust fund I had built, but as I stood in the foyer, it felt incredibly barren. I took off my heels, walking barefoot across the hardwood floor. Everywhere I looked, there were ghosts of our 5 years together. The framed photo on the mantel from our honeymoon in Italy, the slightly worn arm of the sofa where he used to read on Sunday mornings, the lingering scent of his cologne in the hallway. The emotional toll of the last 12 months finally crashed over me. I sank to the floor of the living room, pulling my knees to my chest, and let out a broken sob. I cried for the betrayal. I cried for the exhaustion of pretending everything was fine while my heart was shattering. But most of all, I cried for the girl I used to be, the fiercely loyal, deeply trusting woman who believed that love was enough to build a life on.
I wept until there were no tears left, grieving the death of a dream. But as the first light of dawn began to creep through the living room windows, painting the walls in soft hues of blue and gold, the heavy, suffocating weight in my chest began to lift. I was alone, yes, but I was safe. I had survived the worst, and I had protected myself.
The next morning, I arrived at the corporate office exactly at 8 o'clock. I didn't wear my wedding ring. I wore a sharp navy blue suit, my hair pulled back into a sleek, no-nonsense style. As I walked onto the executive floor, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Word of Mark's sudden departure had clearly rippled through the upper management.
I walked past Mark's old office, ignoring the empty desk where Chloe used to sit, and headed straight for the main conference room. The entire board of directors was already seated, waiting for me. Mr. Sterling stood up as I entered, offering a respectful nod. "Good morning, everyone," I said, taking the seat at the head of the table.
I placed my files down, feeling the solid, reassuring texture of the leather portfolio. "We received Mark's resignation an hour ago," Mr. Sterling announced to the room, "effective immediately, which means we have a transition to manage." "There will be no transition," I stated clearly, looking around the table, meeting each of their eyes with unwavering confidence. "There is only a continuation. We are moving forward with the nationwide expansion, exactly as I outlined in our private meetings. The vision hasn't changed, only the dead weight has been removed." A murmur of agreement went around the table. As we dove into the financial projections, I felt a quiet sense of reconciliation settle over me. I wasn't just healing from a broken marriage, I was reconciling with my own strength, my own worth, and the legacy my father had left me. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in a year, I was truly breathing free.
The weeks following the disastrous anniversary dinner dissolved into a grueling blur of sterile law offices, sharply worded emails, and endless negotiations. Mark, desperate and humiliated by his sudden fall from grace, hired a flamboyant, aggressive attorney who promised to dismantle my trust fund.
They filed motion after aggressive motion, attempting to claim that I had maliciously hidden assets or coerced him into his precarious financial position. But my lawyer, the brilliant family friend who had helped me build my fortress, swatted their desperate attempts away with surgical precision. The trust was absolutely ironclad.
I had broken no laws. I had simply protected my premarital assets and my father's hard-earned inheritance from a husband who was actively plotting to steal them. Sitting across from Mark during our mandatory mediation was a deeply surreal experience. The room smelled of stale coffee and old paper, a stark contrast to the luxurious velvet and champagne of Le Petit Chien.
He looked exhausted, his designer suits hanging loosely on a frame that seemed to have shrunk. The blinding arrogance that had fueled him for the past year was entirely gone, replaced by a bitter, resentful desperation. He tried to play the victim, looking at the mediator with pleading eyes, claiming I had callously planned his ruin behind his back. I listened to his frantic accusations without interrupting, feeling a strange, detached sense of pity. He still didn't understand that his ruin was entirely of his own design. I hadn't pushed him off the ledge. I had simply removed the safety net he thought he was entitled to.
When the mediator gently but firmly explained that his legal avenues were exhausted, Mark finally slumped in his chair, utterly defeated.
With the legal battle effectively paralyzed, the conflict inevitably bled into our extended family. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, while I was working from home, I heard a sharp, insistent knock on my front door. I opened it to find Mark's older sister, Eleanor. We had always shared a warm, cordial relationship, bonding over chaotic holiday dinners and family birthdays. The look on her face today was tight, defensive, and fiercely accusatory. I invited her in out of the pouring rain, offering her a towel and a warm cup of tea, trying my best to maintain the grace of a host, despite the heavy circumstances. Eleanor barely touched her delicate porcelain cup.
She sat stiffly on the absolute edge of the living room sofa, looking around the space as if inspecting it for emotional damage. "He's living in a tiny, furnished apartment downtown," she began, her voice trembling with misplaced indignation and sisterly grief. "He's completely broken. How could you do this to him? 5 years of marriage, and you throw him out on the street over a single mistake?" The word mistake echoed loudly in the quiet room. I took a slow sip of my tea, letting the warmth ground my suddenly racing heart. Mark hadn't told her the truth. He had spun a sympathetic narrative where he was the tragic hero who succumbed to a momentary weakness, and I was the vengeful, cold-hearted wife who took everything in a fit of rage. He had completely omitted the year-long conspiracy, the meticulous financial planning to ruin me, and the fact that he was the one who happily handed me divorce papers. I set my teacup down on the coaster, keeping my hands perfectly steady. "Eleanor, I understand that you are hurting for your brother, and I know you want to protect him. But a mistake is forgetting an anniversary or losing your temper during an argument. What Mark did was a calculated, year-long campaign to strip me of my father's company and the home I bought with my own money." I stood up and walked over to my home office desk, retrieving a thick, printed copy of the hidden messages I had saved. I hesitated for a fraction of a second. I had never intended to weaponize this deeply humiliating pain, but I refused to be painted as the villain in my own sanctuary. I walked back and handed her the heavy stack of papers. "Read them," I said softly, my voice devoid of malice.
"Read how he and his assistant discussed devaluing my shares. Read how they joyfully planned to redecorate this very house while I was still sleeping beside him every night." Eleanor took the pages tentatively, her hands shaking slightly. As her eyes scanned the highlighted text, the remaining color completely drained from her face. The indignant, defensive posture melted away, replaced by a profound, horrified silence. She read page after page, absorbing the undeniable proof of her brother's cruelty laid bare in his own cruel words. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were swimming with tears. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice breaking on the words. "He told me he just had an affair and panicked. I am so incredibly sorry." I nodded, placing a comforting hand on her trembling shoulder. With the painful family intervention resolved, I threw myself entirely into the company. It became both my sanctuary and my salvation. The nationwide expansion demanded my constant, undivided attention, pulling me into late-night strategy sessions and early morning flights across the country. For a long while, the sheer exhaustion was a welcome distraction from the echoing, heavy silence of my large, empty house. Under my sole leadership, the company didn't just survive the scandal, it thrived beyond our wildest projections. The investors, deeply reassured by my decisive handling of the crisis and my clear vision, poured additional funding into our new logistics software. We successfully opened 3 new regional offices within a span of 6 months. I was suddenly being featured in industry magazines, named one of the top female executives in the state. From the outside, I was a soaring, untouchable success. Yet the emotional toll of carrying the heavy crown alone occasionally weighed heavily on my shoulders.
There were quiet moments, standing in a crowded luxury hotel lobby or looking out over the city skyline from a lonely boardroom window, when a sharp pang of grief would strike. I missed having a true partner to share the hard-won victories with. I mourned the effortless companionship I thought I had. But whenever that dark melancholy threatened to pull me under, I firmly reminded myself of the devastating cost of that illusion. The peace I had now, built on a solid foundation of absolute truth and self-reliance, was worth far more than the comforting lies of my past. Exactly 9 months after that fateful anniversary dinner, the final divorce decree arrived in the afternoon mail. It was a thick, formal document, bound with heavy staples and officially notarized, signifying the absolute legal end of us. I sat at my kitchen island, the bright morning sun streaming comfortably through the large windows, and just stared at it.
There was no grand emotional ceremony, no dramatic final confrontation, just a stack of premium paper that reduced a half-decade of shared history, laughter, and eventual betrayal to dry legal jargon and asset divisions. Attached to the front of the decree with a silver paperclip was a handwritten note from Mark. It was brief, written on cheap, lined legal pad paper.
I know I ruined the best thing I ever had. I'm sorry. I hope you find the peace and happiness I couldn't give you. I read the messy handwriting twice, genuinely searching my heart for a spark of anger, a wave of resentment, or even a tiny flicker of lingering love. I found absolutely none of it. The raging, consuming fire of betrayal had completely burned itself out over the past year, leaving behind only the quiet, gray ashes of acceptance. I uncapped my favorite fountain pen, smoothed out the thick paper, and signed my name on the final line of the decree. I didn't cry. I didn't feel broken or lost. I simply felt a profound, deeply settling sense of closure.
I folded the documents, slid them into the provided return envelope, and sealed it shut. The long storm was finally over.
It had been a month since the divorce was finalized. I sat in my living room, a cup of chamomile tea warming my hands, listening to the heavy, rhythmic patter of realistic rain beating against the large glass windows. The steady, looping sound of the storm was deeply atmospheric, acting like a natural, calming balm for my frayed nerves.
I watched the water trace intricate paths down the glass, feeling as though the weather was washing away the last lingering remnants of Mark's presence in my home. Professionally, I was doing some aggressive washing away of my own. That morning, I had authorized a massive cleanup of our company's public portfolio.
I systematically archived and privated almost all of our old marketing campaigns, the ones that had heavily featured Mark as the visionary face of the brand. I only retained 2 foundational, highly successful legacy projects that had already proven their immense value and longevity over the years. It was a strategic, necessary purge.
I was intentionally removing the clutter of the past, making room for a completely fresh, unburdened future. The rain continued its steady, soothing drumbeat outside, and for the first time in over a year, I felt a deep, profound stillness in my soul. I was finally alone, but I was no longer lonely.
With the house finally feeling like my own again, I decided to aggressively reclaim our backyard. Mark had always wanted a stark, modern concrete patio to host his pretentious networking events, but I craved life, warmth, and movement. I hired a landscaper to tear up the cold gray slabs and install a lush, vibrant garden.
At the exact center, I had them build a beautiful, multi-tiered stone water feature. The next weekend, I sat on my new wooden bench, captivated by the gentle, continuous water ripples cascading over the smooth river rocks. The sound was a perfect, unending loop of tranquility. My younger sister Lily came over to see the transformation.
She had been my quiet anchor through the turbulence, offering silent, unwavering support when the legal battles with Mark raged. "It feels completely different out here," Lily said, sitting beside me and softly tracing the edge of the fountain. "It finally feels like you." I smiled, watching the water ripples distort and seamlessly reform my reflection. She was right. I wasn't just redecorating a house, I was actively redesigning my internal landscape. The harsh, rigid lines of my past were being replaced by organic, flowing resilience. I was finally nurturing my own roots, and they were growing deep and strong. A few weeks later, I received an unexpected email. It wasn't from Mark, but from Chloe. The subject line simply read, "Closure." I hesitated before opening it, my finger hovering over the delete button. The tranquil peace I had built felt precious, and I didn't want her toxic energy invading my sanctuary. But a strange sense of emotional detachment won out.
The message was surprisingly brief and completely devoid of her former arrogance. She admitted that Mark had lied to her as well, stringing her along with false promises of immense wealth and unearned status. When the money vanished after that anniversary dinner, so did his charm, revealing a bitter, hollow, and incredibly cruel man. She wrote that she had moved to a different state, starting over at the very bottom of the corporate ladder. She didn't ask for my forgiveness. She knew she didn't deserve it. But she apologized for her role in attempting to destroy my family legacy. I read the words twice, feeling absolutely nothing but a vague, distant pity. I didn't reply. I simply moved the email to the trash folder and emptied it. Her apology didn't change the past, but deleting it solidified my absolute control over my present. Winter arrived with a quiet, breathtaking elegance. I stood by the bay window of my bedroom, watching a heavy, mesmerizing snowstorm blanket the neighborhood. The thick flakes fell in a continuous, silent loop, transforming the world into a pristine, white canvas. It was the perfect visual metaphor for my life right now, a blank, untouched slate waiting for a brilliant new story. I had spent the afternoon reviewing the critical marketing materials for our upcoming software launch. The original pitch, drafted months ago under Mark's direction, featured a male executive as the primary authoritative persona. I had immediately rejected it. I sent an explicit command to our creative team to completely rewrite the script, changing the subject's gender to a female leader. I wanted the new face of our brand to reflect the actual resilience, intelligence, and quiet strength of the woman who built it and saved it from ruin. Watching the snow gently bury the frozen ground outside, I felt a surge of quiet, undeniable pride. I was no longer shaping myself to be a supporting character in a deceitful man's narrative. I was actively writing my own script, and I was making myself the undisputed lead. As spring approached, the company was buzzing with intense, focused energy. We were preparing for the most significant, highly anticipated expansion launch in our history, and I had circled a very specific date on the calendar, May 6th. It was exactly 2 years since the day Mark had handed me those divorce papers. What had once been the anniversary of my deepest humiliation and heartbreak was going to be aggressively repurposed into the anniversary of my greatest professional triumph. I spent hours in the boardroom, meticulously reviewing every detail, ensuring our operational metrics met the incredibly strict new thresholds I had established. It was exhausting, demanding work, but it was incredibly fulfilling. I wasn't just running a business. I was proving to myself and to the entire industry that my father's legacy was safe and flourishing in my hands. On the eve of May 6th, I stayed late in my office, looking out at the glittering city lights. I vividly remembered the terrified, heartbroken woman sitting in that fancy restaurant, gripping her phone under the table, and I marveled at the formidable CEO she had become. The launch was ready. I was completely ready. The May 6th launch was a spectacular, unmitigated success. The targeted marketing campaign, featuring our new female-led narrative, resonated deeply with our audience and our major investors. By noon, our server metrics were completely off the charts, and extravagant congratulatory bouquets were flooding the main reception area. Mr. Sterling called me personally, his voice thick with genuine respect, to formally tell me that the board was authorizing an additional executive bonus for my flawless execution. In the midst of the chaotic, joyful celebration, my private cell phone buzzed with an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. It was Mark. His voice was ragged, small, and terribly lonely. "I saw the industry news," he whispered over the line. "Congratulations. You did what I never could." There was a long, heavy pause. I waited for the old familiar anger, or perhaps the gloating satisfaction of revenge, but neither came. "Thank you, Mark," I replied, my voice perfectly even and emotionally detached. "Goodbye." I hung up the phone and immediately blocked the number.
The silence that followed wasn't heavy or sad. It was the beautiful, resonant silence of absolute closure. The final frayed thread tying me to my painful past had just been snipped. With the company running flawlessly and my personal life wrapped in a comforting, peaceful routine, I found myself with a new, unfamiliar abundance of free time. But instead of resting, a new, powerful desire began to take root in my heart. I kept thinking about the profound isolation I had felt when I first discovered Mark's betrayal on his tablet. I remembered the suffocating weight of keeping the secret, the desperate need for guidance, and the terrifying fear of starting over from scratch. I realized that my personal story, the deep pain, the meticulous financial planning, and the ultimate victory could be a vital lifeline for someone else currently trapped in a similar domestic nightmare. I wanted to share my journey. Not out of vengeance or a petty desire for attention, but to offer a practical, emotional blueprint for survival. I decided to create an audio series, a safe, accessible space where I could discuss emotional neglect, financial self-defense within a marriage, and the complex dynamics of household betrayal. It would be entirely my voice, my narrative, and my absolute truth, designed specifically to empower those who felt utterly powerless in their own homes. I converted a small, unused guest bedroom into a private, dedicated recording space. I wanted the production to be highly streamlined and completely independent of complex video crews or stressful editing schedules. I set up a sleek, professional microphone on a sturdy wooden desk, deliberately positioning the soft ambient lighting so that it cast an artistic shadow over the room. I designed the setup in a podcast-style visual format. When I sat at the desk, the large, metallic grill of the microphone intentionally obscured the lower half of my face. It was a calculated, protective measure. It allowed me to maintain a crucial layer of personal privacy and simplified the visual synchronization while still establishing an intimate, deeply personal connection with the listener. It completely eliminated the pressure of appearing picture-perfect, drastically reducing my editing time and allowing me to focus entirely on the heavy emotional weight of the words. I arranged my digital tablet with my script notes, took a slow sip of warm chamomile water, and looked at the glowing red standby light on the recording interface. The stage was finally set. I reached out and pressed the record button. The digital timer on the screen began to count up, silently marking the seconds. I leaned forward into the microphone, taking a slow, deeply grounding breath. "Hello," I began, my voice steady and clear in the quiet, shadowed room. My name doesn't matter nearly as much as my story does. 5 years into my marriage, on what was supposed to be a romantic milestone anniversary, my husband handed me divorce papers at a fancy restaurant. He and his mistress thought they were taking my house and my company. They didn't know I had spent an entire year building an impenetrable fortress right under their noses. I spoke for an hour, detailing the quiet heartbreak, the meticulous legal maneuvering with the trust fund, and the terrifying leap into independence. I didn't embellish the details or dramatize the pain. The raw truth of family betrayal was powerful enough on its own. As I spoke, I felt the last microscopic fragments of my trauma being released into the ether. I wasn't just telling a story, I was drawing a map out of the dark. I finished the recording, carefully exported the audio file, and gently closed my laptop. Stepping out of the studio, I walked down the quiet hallway of my secure, beautiful home. I went out to the backyard, wrapping a soft woven shawl around my shoulders against the evening chill. It was a magnificent night. The air was crisp, and the stone fountain I had installed was running beautifully, its water cascading in a gentle, perfect, continuous loop. I sat on the wooden bench, closing my eyes and letting the soothing, ASMR-like sound of the water ripples completely wash over me.
I had survived the ultimate betrayal.
I had successfully protected my family's legacy, reclaimed my personal self-worth, and found a meaningful way to turn my deepest pain into a source of enduring strength for others. The fragile illusion of my perfect marriage was dead, but the solid reality I had built in its ashes was infinitely more beautiful.
I was a successful CEO, a loyal sister, a survivor, and finally, unequivocally, the sole author of my own destiny. The long storm had officially passed, and the peace I found in its wake was absolute.